Yay. What up, folks? Welcome to the Path to You. I don't know what episode we're on. Today we are with Julian DeGuzman. Julian Marcus DeGuzman, I've introduced you to.
Yep.
And instead of introducing him, I'm going to let him introduce himself since he's here. Hey, Julian.
Hi. Hello.
Share with the community who you are, what you do, and how you got here.
Well, my name's Julian, and how I got here, like professionally, personally,
However you
all
want
of
to
that.
answer it.
Okay, cool. I am currently working as a musical theater actor full time. That's my gig. That's my, I guess, full time work. Professionally, how I got there, I started off as a kid dancing at a dance studio, and my dad particularly, used dance as kind of a tool to teach discipline and hoping it would translate to academic rigor. But I just became so involved with it throughout my life. Dance studios, competitions, in tap, jazz, ballet, hip hop, everything, to the point where it just became normal. And so when I was applying to colleges, I began to frame that in my mind of, well, dance is what I'm used to, so I might as well keep pursuing this and studying it. So I went to the University of California, Irvine, and got my Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Dance, and then not long after that, moved to New York and started auditioning pretty much immediately, and I've been lucky to be performing pretty consistently ever since, which is actually, I'm very, very, very fortunate to have been working as consistently as I have the last few years. So right now the gig is the national tour of Hello, Dolly. We're currently on a little bit of a break, and then I go to Pittsburgh tonight, actually, for the next city, on next stop of the tour. And I guess because, speaking professionally about where I've been, it kind of shaped like where I am personally, and vice versa, I guess. But personally, I grew up here in Alameda, California. I went to school down in Southern California. I am a proud Filipino-American. Like, my mom was very, very good at instilling me the cultural values by bringing me and my sister, my older sister, Robin, back and forth to the Philippines a lot as a kid. It's interesting because as an adult, I am now unpacking a lot of that throughout my childhood, and there's a lot of things culturally that I look back on and I'm like, wow, I really value that. This, not so much. But so here I am today, pursuing what was always a goal as a kid, but that dream, it definitely did evolve and change throughout my life, and it's led me to where I am personally and professionally at the same time. Since the work I do is, I consider it like it's very emotional work in a lot of ways. It's emotionally loaded to get there, and it's emotionally loaded to do 8 times a week, because it's being a dancer in a show 8 times a week. It's physically demanding work, and so it's I mean, it's not like you're out in a field for hours throughout the day, but in terms of, it's like being on all the time, which can be exhilarating and thrilling and fulfilling, but also exhausting.
Totally. You can't have that like high, and then when you have it that high, you're gonna come down super hard.
Right.
Unless you're like consistently coming back down.
Yeah, and so I guess inevitably it kind of speaks to, like, I guess I'm trying to see things personally and professionally, but they like interweave so much, since we spend so much of our time and presence at work. Yeah, that's where I'm at now.
Cool. Let's there's so many things that I want to unpack from there.
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit more about like your day-to-day on tour versus your day-to-day on Broadway versus your day-to-day, like, I think there was a point in you were working in Arizona maybe, or?
Oh yeah, that was Arizona was my second professional gig doing Tarzan back in 2012, the year after literally just a few months after I moved to New York. That was like one of my first professional jobs that I did.
Right.
The difference between working on Broadway versus on tour, it's actually pretty similar, I would say, because I've been lucky that the tours that I've been on have been pretty consistent sit downs, like lengthy sit downs. A week doesn't sound like a long time, but in comparison to, there are a lot of other tours which we call bus and truck tours, which, you know, at most you're in a city for 2 nights.
Oh, wow.
So when you're in a city for a week, it's it goes by pretty fast, but if you're able to find some semblance of normalcy throughout the week, I guess that's a constant challenge. I would say that's the main difference between touring and being in New York on Broadway, is that you are recreating normalcy in any environment, and you're constantly shifting from week to week to week. Granted, as I mentioned, we have it much better than a lot of other situations out there, but yeah, you just have to adapt, and that's the thrilling thing about it, because you're constantly learning new things, how to adapt to your living situation. If you're in a hotel, if you're in an Airbnb, you know, your proximity to work, to the theater, figuring that out. If you have roommates, but you also like get to go out and explore and do. I've seen a lot of the country at this point, and so I definitely do have a lot of feelings about the physical, social, cultural place that we're in America as Americans. So that has kind of shaped at least where I'm at, the place that I'm in on tour right now. There's a lot of layers. It's very complicated, at least like how I see touring right now versus how I toured 5 years ago.
Right.
Being on Broadway, it's you're living in New York, which in my mind is and continues to be the greatest city in the world. You're there. It's expensive, but you're in one place, and so the idea of community is a lot larger than the idea of community on tour is who you're surrounded with.
Right.
Which there are pros and cons to both. You know, like my tour castmates, it becomes family, and family in all the sense of the word. Family, in that like these people are there for you when you need them and they need you, and family in that sometimes they just drive you effing crazy. And
feel free to curse.
okay, cool. I wasn't sure, but
we're not sponsored yet.
Okay, not yet. So it's interesting because when you're in New York, at least for me personally, the stimulation, my nervous system, can get to a point where I have to leave at some point because it's a lot on the senses living in New York. I didn't truly understand what love-hate meant living there until I actually lived there. And I've never loved a city so intensely and resented it so much at the same time. So when you're on Broadway, like when I started on this Broadway tour, we had just recently closed the Broadway production of Hello, Dolly. And at that point, I was actually very ready to leave. I had a lot of feelings about the industry that I was in there, and I was like, okay, I need to leave so I can come back and appreciate it. So it's like so when you're in New York, you're like, okay, get me out of here, and that brought me on tour. And now that I'm tour, I do have those feelings now of like, okay, get me back to New York,
Right.
which will happen, I don't know, at some point in the future. Definitely within the next between 6 months and a year, since I'm still contracted. But yeah, New York offers community and a real, like, identifiable safe space that you don't really have to think too hard about.
Yeah.
Versus when you're on tour. Sometimes a lot of your perspectives and assumptions about society are not the norm there, and so it's challenging in that way to have to recalibrate your perspective. So what was the original question again? I know it was
The difference between
touring
Broadway
and
and
Broadway, yeah.
yeah.
Right.
Going,
Hopefully covered that.
you did. Going back to, again, we can unpack so much of this. Going back to creating normalcy on tour, how do you create normalcy on tour?
Before you start tour, you have this idea of what you're gonna do.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the very first city that we were in was Utica, New York, upstate, because that's where we teched the show. We had to re-tech the show, as you call it, up there for 3 weeks. And I had this idea that I was going to continue this morning routine in New York. I had this morning routine where I go down to my favorite coffee shop in Harlem, which is just a couple blocks away, Manhattanville Coffee. It's like my favorite place. And I have my matcha latte, and I read my book, and maybe have some kind of croissant that they offer. Like, that was my normal in New York. And that's like, and I would meditate, and then I would go to the gym, and that's like kind of the start of the day leading up to the show at night, work. On tour, you have this idea of, okay, I'm gonna recreate that in every city. But a lot of times, you know, you're not necessarily in an environment that allows that. Like, you're in hotel rooms a lot of times, so it's or you have roommates in order to save money, because some cities are surprisingly more expensive than others. Like some cities are cheaper. Other cities are surprisingly expensive. Like Nashville, Tennessee. I had no idea it was going to be such an expensive city. Okay. Come to realize it's experiencing like a tech boom in the same way that the Bay Area is. So that's why like downtown housing prices are so high.
They're experiencing a lot of the same things that we're experiencing.
Right. Yeah. So I find that in a lot of cities, it's like the housing is expensive, so it's hard to put, like, if you don't want to take the company offers blocks of housing, like blocks of rooms at hotels at a rate for us, and we get per diem to pay for that housing. But a lot of times we like to, you know, see what else is out there in terms of Airbnbs or hotels or like stays, whatever. And I've found on this tour that, wow, like, yeah, the economy is doing really well, so well to the point that like I can't find a reasonable place to stay in certain cities that is like convenient to the theater, and I can't like have a comfortable space, or it just takes me shelling out a little bit more than I was expecting, which, you know, you kind of have to do sometimes. So that's what I kind of have to do to recreate like serenity in my space, to like start the day, waking up,
to come back down from the high.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good at this point about when I exit the stage door, I leave that energy there. So I'm pretty good about allowing my nervous system to take a rest after work. I'm not like the idea for a lot of people, I guess, or like the stereotype of people performing in shows is that you're constantly up here, and that's there for a reason. It's very much true. Like sleep deprivation and anxiety are very much a real thing of being a performer. But I've been lucky, especially over the past couple of years, to have my tools to combat that and to manage that. So I'm able to do simple breathing exercises, and it's enough for me to like chill out just a little bit, so I can hopefully get enough sleep. It's hard when, you know, when you have 1 weekers, like back to back to back to back,
Right.
and your 1 day a week, 1 day off a week is typically Monday, but that's also a travel day. So it's not necessarily a real day off. You're
Right.
spending your day off traveling, and sometimes if you're flying from city to city and there's a delay and you're stuck at the airport, and soon a flight that was supposed to be from like 11 landing at 1 turns into 11, you're delayed 3 hours, and then you arrive at after 4, and you don't arrive at your housing until 5, and it turns into a whole
Right.
day of traveling.
Right.
So that can be a lot on your emotional spirit and your mental health. But like anything, you have to have ways to manage that, and
Right.
thankfully I have those methods. They're really tested sometimes, really, really tested. Like we were flying from DC to Charlotte, and my girlfriend Maria in the show, we were running late. Thanks to me, I woke up a little bit late. We were running late to the airport, and she was able to check into her flight, and I was like right after her, and they cut it off like right at me. So that just like immediately elevated my stress level. But somehow, some way, shape, or form, I was able to like find peace in that day, and like, you know what? I'm just going to focus on this new book I have, Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper, fantastic read, and focus on that. And I was grateful for it because I spent the entire day at that airport just reading my book. But I easily, like a few years ago, I easily could have allowed that to just let me, you know.
Out, yeah.
So yeah, this tends to happen during podcasts where like we just start on like one thing, and then like I won't remember what the
that's
original
okay.
thing. Yeah,
That's the whole point.
right. Cool.
So
where were we?
With that, I will then ask you, in sports, and I feel like in entertainment, we're not taught about mental health. We're not taught the tools to deal with the things that come up, whether it's on tour, like you said, having these super highs and then having to come back and go to sleep after you've just done 2 shows in a day, versus an athlete who gets hurt and has to sit out for the year, may or may not come back after their injury. How did you learn your tools to separate and to calm your nervous system and to recenter yourself and find the gratitude?
I mean, to be honest, by making a lot of mistakes in how I handle my emotions, especially when I'm pushed to points where I am tested and emotions are elevated. I did the Newsies tour about 4 or 5 years ago, and that was the most physically demanding work I've ever done. And there were moments where I would be incredibly tired, and if something that was out of my control happened at work that affected me, my emotional response would be so reactionary, and I would have some type of verbal or physical outburst just by like, I don't know, it could be something as simple as like slamming my hand down on a proper set piece out of frustration, or like literally yelling fuck backstage because I was pushed to that point. It's that like immediate remorse that happens after, and like repeatedly over and over again. I guess the point where I really had to develop the tools was dealing with a breakup a few years ago, and it made me really confront a lot of unaddressed aspects to myself that I had never really had the mirror of. I mean, I have to credit like my ex, the last person I was with, for introducing me to meditation, and then but it wasn't until the breakup where I actually actively chose to look into it and study meditation. And my friend Minami in New York that I did Miss Saigon with, she introduced me to journaling, and on my own I found yoga at Yoga to the People, Upper West Side. Yep. So that kind of became my holy trinity in dealing with mental health. Uh, I'm still open to therapy, but at least for the really really intense year that I was dealing with the mental health residual of a breakup, those became the three most powerful things for me that I literally was just like, okay, I'm gonna try this app, Headspace, and you know what, I'll just do it, whatever. It sounds weird, but I started it, and then that immediate feeling of like weight off was like nothing had ever really addressed or had done that for me before.
Yeah.
And then yoga was always something that I did as a workout or just to stretch.
Right.
And then I took a class, yoga to the people, and the immediate feeling after was partly physical, but it was the mental emotional release. Like anything that felt was vibrating with a lot of energy in my mind prior to the class had suddenly just settled. So there's beauty in that. And then a lot of the thoughts that stirred in my mind continuously over and over, I bought a journal and I just decided to put pen to paper and write about anything. That was also like a releasing that tension from my mind to the paper. And so those were like I call it my holy trinity of dealing with mental health. And that's what I've stuck with. The hardest thing about tour has been being able to recreate that in any environment, because I no longer have the structure of a yoga class, of my donation-based yoga class, a yoga to the people, where you come in, people don't know you, you're able to come in and out. That's kind of what I miss. Versus like a yoga class in this city where like everyone knows each other, and it's like you're a guest coming in. It's like constantly having to reintroduce a new environment to yourself, and not, it's like the built up like not wanting to really share that. It's like a constant test of that. So those are my three tools, and I try as best as I can to honor that wherever I am.
It resonates so much, like everything that you're saying, and it didn't actually click in my head until you said it, like how much those three were also pivotal in my breakup, and how much of myself I didn't realize that were in my shadows until we broke up, and until like it was this mirror of, I've been doing this in every single relationship. I need to stop this pattern, or else nothing's going to change, and this is going to keep happening.
Right.
And it's just, and again, like that journal, the meditation, the yoga, it all just helps get everything out into perspective. Yeah. And the yoga in particular, like I know what you mean when you go to a really good solid class and you, at the end, I tend to cry a lot. Like if it's a really good yoga class and I release, then I will have the ugly cry and sobbing tears. And if it's in a community that I feel safe in, then I will cry out loud and not hold it in. But if it's a new studio, then I'm like,
and I guess also as a male, I came to realize too, is that I did begin my like yoga journey, and it was very beneficial. I also found that there was something, for some reason, physical that wasn't quite, that was still internalized somehow, even despite the yoga. And then I ended up taking a workout class, and there was this one exercise where we had to like, we take these like sandbags and we like slam on the floor, and I legit like started crying as I was doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that, looking back on that, I was addressing, like, I was expressing the rage in that like violent physical action of like slamming a sandbag.
Right.
And that was my outlet. And yoga was able to address other emotional realms of my psyche, but then the actual physical, like that weird aggression, it was like letting out that aggression was a very odd thing. How like I'm in this class at Equinox, like a sandbell, that's what it's called, slamming a sandbell into the ground, and it was like the first time I felt like, damn, I had a lot of frustration to let out in this poor little 15-pound sandbell. Yeah, so man, breakups are rough, and we tend to think of them as like a phase that we just go through.
Right.
But I don't think what we really talk about is like how it also can, I mean, no breakup is the same, but I just feel like they're not really addressed as like how our emotional response to them is very similar to how we feel, like the grief that we feel losing a loved one, or it's very similar in that vein. And so like I'm happy to talk about it openly, like how I was affected by it.
Right. And it's interesting. I feel like in most, I can't speak for everyone, but in my past, the response to breakups was like, well, fuck that guy. Or like, well, I'm better than that anyways.
Yeah.
You're not dealing with what happened. You're just pushing it to the side, saying you're better, putting out more anger, and not resolving what happened, what transpired, and like honoring the love that did happen, versus, like you said, going through the grief, allowing it to happen, letting out the rage in healthy ways, and process what happened, and still honor what was.
Yeah.
Because it happened for a reason, and there were good times. Like, just because there's no longer good times doesn't mean that they didn't exist.
I think it does take time though, and to reach that place where you're able to lead with gratitude rather than resentment. I think it's natural to that initial process. If you were on the if you feel like at the time felt like you were on the receiving end of the breakup, like if you're in that space, it takes time to process those emotions, the rawness of the anger, sadness, fear also. And it, like, I'm able to lead with gratitude now, because I'm like, man, I don't know where I would be if I didn't go through that process. I probably would have continued on this path of a lot of emotional dysfunction, not addressing a lot of issues that were so internalized throughout my life, and the veneer of the work that I do as a facade of happiness despite what was happening backstage in my mind, no pun intended. Yeah, so I'm able to lead with more gratitude now, because that's part of that's all part of the journey. I don't quite agree with the statement, like everything happens for a reason. Sometimes things just happen, and some reasons I can't reconcile with, but it's like being at peace with that, and being able to not move on but move forward.
Right. Yeah, I think, and I tend to say that like everything happens for a reason, but even I believe that it's not necessarily everything happens for a reason, but we can put meaning behind everything. So even if this didn't happen for a reason, like, well, what is this here to teach me?
Right.
What can I learn from this situation? It's all about perspective rather than the thing that I've been saying a lot is this is happening for me, not to me.
Yeah.
And so having that perspective has really helped me sit back and think about, okay, well, why is this happening? How am I benefiting from this? And if I can't figure that out right now, that's okay. It'll show up when it needs to, or when I'm ready for it.
Yeah.
And so it's all, completely perspective shift to think that way.
Totally.
Bouncing off of that, I want to go back to your hip surgeries.
Yeah.
And I mean, we talk about mental health, we talk about like perseverance and the power of the mind. I feel like at one point you were told you couldn't walk after one of your surgeries, or is that? Or you weren't going to be able to walk, you weren't going to be able to dance anymore?
Yeah, so I guess I'll explain that journey, my hip surgery. So 2008, 2009, God, 10 years ago already, madness. Flashback to that, or before that even. When I was a lot younger, I started to feel a lot of weird, I was dancing throughout my life, right? So when I was like 18, 19, I started to feel this odd sensation in my hip. Like whenever I would externally rotate my hip, I would feel this weird thing there. And I just never really addressed it because it was not enough to affect.
I just had an aha moment in my head.
Oh yeah.
So this is like backstory, and I don't mean to cut you off, but before I forget what happens, there's a connection that's making some sense. So we're talking about yoga. In yoga, in yoga teacher training, you learn that a lot of your emotions get stored in your hips.
Yeah. I've heard that.
The central of your fight or flight system, like your central nervous system, connects to your psoas and your hip region, those muscles. So when you have something traumatic happen, and trauma can be any range of trauma, you go into fight or flight mode. So it's either run or curl up or whatever it is. So it's all from the hip region. And your sister also talks about her hips. So Robin talks about her hips and saying that she doesn't have great range, she doesn't have great motion. You're saying that you've always felt this thing when you were in your teens about hips. Gabor Mate that I was talking to you about yesterday talks about stress disease connection, and so when we don't deal with trauma, it gets stored in the body. And knowing what your parents went through, specifically your dad, and growing up in America, in Harlem and all these places, like kind of knowing his journey, knowing the rest of your family and the work that they've done with the International Hotel, like so much trauma that's maybe or maybe not dealt with, but then it's passed down to generations that gets stored in your fight or flight system.
Never really framed it that way in my mind.
And that just like happened as you were talking.
Yeah, never thought of it that way.
And now I have chills.
Yo, that's crazy. Well,
We can
I mean,
unpack
if that's
more of that later.
yeah, I'm going to. I mean, because I guess, my hip situation was so detrimental to a lot of my journey after that, and so I guess explaining what I went through.
Yeah.
I had this hip pain, and then around 2008, 2009 is when it started to really get more intense. And the first time that I ever really took initiative was when I was in my modern dance class at UC Irvine, and we were doing this across the floor exercise, and I went to step onto my left foot, and I immediately just crumbled to the ground. That kind of happened the months leading up to it, but this time it had actually happened in class. And my teacher had known that I had some hip pain. I was modifying certain things throughout class, and then it finally all happened in one moment, boom, in front of the entire class. My teacher, she almost kind of reprimanded me in front of everyone, saying you need an x-ray. When are you gonna get an x-ray? It's like your car keeps breaking down. When are you gonna get it fixed?
Right.
And I felt a little bit shameful and kind of called out in front of everybody. So I was like, fuck, okay, fine, I'll go. And so I actually went and got an x-ray. And that's when, it was actually my mom's colleague who ran my x-ray, and he found a small lesion on my femoral head, my left femur head, and he immediately knew it was some sort of bone cyst, about the size of a golf ball. And that's when he had said, do you have another major that you're working on? Because dance, it just doesn't look like it's gonna be possible. That was what really scared the shit out of me, because dance was my normal,
right,
my entire
that
life.
was life.
yeah, and then the fact that somebody was telling me I wouldn't be able to do it anymore
Right.
sent a shockwave through me. So I had that surgery, and within a couple months, I was like back up on my feet and doing back to my normal regular activities.
Mm-hmm.
And then about a year later, the tumor, I started feeling the same sensations again, and so I was like, ah, shit. So I went back, got the X-ray, and the tumor had recurred. And by that point, I was just about to graduate. So I graduated, and then I actually moved back up to my parents' house here in Alameda, and their approach was going to be different. The first time for my next surgery, the first time they had grafted bone from my iliac crest, mixed it with allograft, which is cadaver bone,
Mm-hmm.
and they packed it onto the site in order for it to heal
Mm-hmm.
more naturally.
Mm-hmm.
This next surgery I had, the approach was they were going to take bone cement. They're going to clear out the bone cyst that was there, and they were going to put in bone cement because the exothermic reaction of the bone cement would hopefully kill all remaining tumor cyst cells that were there. So that is actually what I've had in my hip ever since.
Okay.
And so my journey after my second hip surgery, I was living here in Alameda at my parents' house, and I had my surgery, and I was on crutches for 7 weeks. And interesting, because orthopedic surgeon never actually prescribed PT. He was just like, "Oh, you're young. You're athletic. You'll be fine." Never actually prescribed PT. And I tell my PTs now that I work with in the industry, and they're like, "Yeah, you probably should have prescribed a PT." But that's another story.
Right.
But yeah, so I came back to that second surgery
Mm-hmm.
with such a hunger and desire to get back to my normal self, because I remember thinking after my second surgery was, I wish I could just walk normally, but I wasn't supposed to place any weight onto my left leg.
Yeah.
And I remember telling myself, from this point on, I will never even take for granted taking a single step. And so I came back once I got off my crutches and I was back to my self-rehab. I just came back with this hunger, this desire to like improve athletically and to develop myself to a point that I hadn't been before, with, you know, getting myself in shape as a dancer. And then that's when the idea started to move to New York, to go to New York, because I knew my sister had gone there. And at the time she was doing the national tour of Beauty and the Beast. And so I was like, well, if Robin can do it, then I can do it. I have to do it. So I've had, for an entire summer, as I was like rehabbing, I had this goal in my mind. All right, I'm gonna go to New York. And I booked a one-way ticket. There was like a Southwest sale, which I've learned is not the most efficient way to fly to New York, to the West Coast. Layovers, not fun. I can't do those anymore. Bought a one-way ticket. I remember telling my mom, I was like, so I got a ticket to New York, it's one way. She was like, what? Why are you doing that? And I explained to her.
Mom, that was perfect.
Yeah. And then I explained to her, you know, I was like, I'm feeling confident enough to start auditioning. And she kind of got it, but didn't really. And I told my dad, and my dad was just like, it took him a while to process that. And then like a few days later, he was like, I'm glad you're going to New York. It's good. He said something like, go baby, or something weird in my mind.
Yeah,
that I'm like,
your dad would
okay,
say.
let's block that out. But yeah, so I did that, and then like I went to New York, and I stayed with my cousin's family. My cousin's from Cebu, Philippines, who had moved there, and she'd been working as a teacher. They have 3 kids, so it's my cousin, her husband, and they're 3 boys at the time, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment on Avenue X in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. And they brought me in, and I stayed in the room with 2 of the boys, and they had the youngest stay in the bed with parents. And that's where I lived my first like month and a half, 2 months that I was in New York, less than 2 weeks after I arrived, I booked my first professional gig at a theater in Philadelphia called Walnut Street Theater, part of the ensemble in The King and I. That was the first gig, and then after that point, it was just like pretty much almost nonstop. I did work at Shake Shack for a couple months.
I remember that.
Yes, that was my second survival gig in New York. Worked at Shake Shack, and then after that, I booked Newsies Broadway, and then I've been lucky to do national tours or regional theater or other Broadway shows since then.
What's been your favorite?
I would say Newsies was the gig for me, and it's where I like really applied everything that I had learned my entire life. So in terms of that kind of, I was perfect for it because all of my skill sets fit in so perfectly, and everything that I had learned my whole life as a dancer, all the lessons that my dad had put me into my entire life led me up to that point. But Hello, Dolly Broadway was the first time. First off, I was like really on my own. Like I wasn't dating or anything. It was that during that time was when I was completely on my own, and it was time that I had learned to confront and acknowledge and deal with a lot of my emotional stuff that I had been artificially inflating because of the notoriety of the previous jobs that I'd had. And that was probably my favorite emotional experience, because doing that show and the feeling of growing and learning about myself, learning about my strengths and my weaknesses, coming to terms with that, very, very hard learned lessons, very, very difficult emotional lessons, while also learning and acknowledging and appreciating the joys and privileges of my life. That whole process was so important for me. And I look back on that period. I mean, not to mention, I was sharing a stage with Bernadette Peters every night, which is like, damn, that was cool, you know? So that it felt elevated, but not for the reasons. It felt like a good period of my life, not for the reasons that I had seen before. Because I'm in a Broadway show. It was just, it just happened circumstantially that it was also a great period of emotional and personal growth. And that's what I focus on.
From that, oh my God, there's so many questions I want to ask you. From that emotional and personal growth has stemmed this new, not new path for you, but I feel like it's starting these new creative outlets for you that you've kind of always had, but now they're just, again, forming into putting everything that you've learned over the years all together. 6 months ago, you did Conflicted. Can you talk about that and what inspired that, and moving forward, ideas from that?
So when I was offered the Hello Dolly tour, I knew on the schedule that they had given us that we were going to be in San Francisco for 4 weeks. So I knew during that time I wanted to do something. I wanted it to be a culmination of like my years performing in New York, that I wanted something to share with my home community, because I don't know where that motivation came from, but I knew I wanted to offer something, whether it was like a cabaret of me just like singing songs to my local community. I didn't know what it was going to be. Leading up to that point, doing Hello Dolly on Broadway, I'd spent a lot of that time being completely on my own, and when you spend that much time, at least for me, I became very introspective for a lot of my past and a lot of my upbringing, a lot about my life. And one thing that was always kind of on the back burner, but was never, I didn't really celebrate, except for brief moments in college where I was involved with like Filipino cultural nights, that sort of thing. But it was never something that I valued intensely.
Mm-hmm.
The experience of doing Miss Saigon was a very layered, complicated experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was my second Broadway show, but having grown up in California, Asian culture was always something understood and valued and authenticated at all times.
Mm-hmm.
It was something I never really had to think about.
Mm-hmm.
But doing Miss Saigon, which the show, as you know, has had a legacy of cultural inauthenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And my hope going into this revival was that the authenticity would really be a focus.
Mm-hmm.
And then we start rehearsals, and you know, some things here and there, I say, okay, I don't know if that's like quite the culture,
Mm-hmm.
that's more Japanese, but whatever, it's a job, could just continue on that rope. Doing the show over the course of the year, also sharing that experience with fellow Filipinos, was an interesting and a really transformative experience for me leading into Hello, Dolly Broadway. So, because I immediately, after we closed Miss Saigon, less than a week later, I was on stage at Hello, Dolly.
Oh, wow. Did you audition for Hello, Dolly? Or?
I auditioned for Hello, Dolly while I was in Miss Saigon,
Okay.
because Miss Saigon, we always knew was going to be a limited engagement, 1 year run. So I knew it was ending in January, so I auditioned and they gave me the offer, and I started, like I said, less than a week later. So doing Miss Saigon, it also coincided with my breakup.
Mm-hmm.
And during the breakup, I had learned that she had immediately begun dating a white guy.
Mm-hmm.
And it did something for me that was unprecedented for me. I had no idea how much that would be a narrative that would affect me. And being in Miss Saigon, being in this environment where at the time I had very, very strong feelings about cultural authenticity and the stories and narratives that are portrayed, and knowing that the feeling of abandonment for someone with a white background became more than just it became representative of the larger political environment that we were in. And so by the time we closed Miss Saigon and went into Hello, Dolly, I began to retreat into this what we call identity politics, where we retreat into, you know, our own emotional safe spaces culturally. And I began to really keep in mind also, I went from Miss Saigon, which is a 95% show comprised of Asians, to Hello, Dolly, where it was like 90% white and I was the Asian.
Yeah.
I kind of naturally retreated into this mode, combined with the idea of feeling abandoned for a white guy. I began to like research like my own culture like crazy. I started reading books about Filipino-American psychology, Kevin Dolly, J.R. David. I started reading all these books. This is also at the time when the crisis at the border, children were being detained, families being separated, and began to have a lot of strong feelings about strong emotional reactions to that, which further entrenched my political views. And it got me to the point where when I got the offer to do the Hello, Dolly tour, I had known that I was gonna have 3 weeks off. So I was like, okay, during that time, I had been so curious about like native Filipino culture, pre-colonial indigenous Filipino culture, and I had almost this obsession of it, of like, it was something that I was like, this is my identity, and like you're gonna abandon me for a white guy, like, you left this native indigenous person that is connected to the earth in his community as like this chest pounding thing. And so I knew when I got the offer to do the Hello Dolly tour, I would have 3 weeks off, and the idea was, okay, I'm gonna go to the Philippines and I'm gonna experience indigenous culture like at the forefront. I'm gonna see what it's about, and I'm gonna have this romanticized idea of native culture in the Philippines, of who I am and where I come from, and almost like an exclusive club that I was a part of. So during the 3-week layoff in December, I take the trip to the Philippines, and a series of events are such that it just keeps getting pushed back and pushed back, and I start questioning, like, wait a minute, why am I here? And then I actually get to the point where I meet the tribe, and I'm all hype, and I'm all ready to experience this indigenous culture and learn their ways and see how they like hunt and start fires and, you know, pick fruit off of trees. And they're wearing their bahags and their loincloths and their spears, and they're all tatted up, and their feather headdresses and all this shit. And then I see them, and they're wearing like basketball shorts, chinelas, tank tops. The chief of the tribe, his name was Mang Nicanor. He was wearing like a Yankees fitted. I was like, wait a minute, this isn't what I was hoping for.
Expectation hangover.
Yeah, and it's so it I didn't know what I was gonna do for my show until a few months after, when I started to unpack that trip, and I began to realize, wait, the only reason why I was so obsessed with this indigenous identity is because I felt abandoned, and I didn't really get a chance to properly process my breakup, and I didn't see myself I didn't have a strong emotional foundation to see myself in a positive, valid light to begin with. And so I was latching onto this idea of indigenous identity to make up for feelings of abandonment. And that's what I decided to center my show on, was that experience. And you hear a lot nowadays about people, especially men, boys, who become radicalized, whether it's through, you know, neo-Nazi skinhead young white men feeling emotionally isolated, so they latch on to that identity, or, you know, in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, through YouTube and through literature spread over the internet, are able to reach out to young Muslim men in Western countries and convince them that this is the missing part of their life. People who tapping into their feelings of isolation and loneliness in the society that they're in. And I wasn't to that level, but I definitely felt that to a degree, because I wanted to take on this indigenous identity to say, like, fuck you, like, we're part of the resistance, and I come from this third world identity that is connected to all native peoples throughout the land, and that is my identity now. That's who I am. Like, I have something to prove. I had something to prove. And I came to realize after that trip that I really don't have anything to prove, because it's like the history is all there. That's who we are. I mean, I don't have to be like pounding my chest about it. And I'm still very, very proud. In fact, it actually gives me a more genuine appreciation for the struggles that we as a people, as Filipinos, have gone through and continue to endure. Colonization in the form of colonization from the Spaniards, colonization from the Americans, and now this form of neocolonialism and the overseas foreign worker phenomenon, which is the largest migrant worker phenomenon in the world. There's a lot to unpack in that, and I mean, I'm happy that I'm at least able to like acknowledge and talk about it and
Yeah.
be like, oh, that's why
Yeah.
I have a lot of those types of cultural and identity issues.
Right.
So that is essentially what the show that I wrote was about.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like a first draft when I did it
Mm-hmm.
in San Francisco, like in front of friends and family.
Right.
Man, the support though was incredible. I was in awe. The people who showed up, dude. I had friends from high school that I haven't seen since high school there
Yeah.
that showed up. I was like, I had no idea. So that was very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So after that show happened, I kind of just put it away for a little bit because I'm like, that was a lot to process.
you
Like,
gotta
I don't want to
integrate.
think about it. I'm just gonna focus. Me and Maria planned a trip to Cuba, and so I was like, I'm just gonna focus on that. And that in itself was a whole
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
With her identity, because her parents left Cuba at a young age. Her mom left Cuba at 6 years old, escaping the Castro regime, and there's also a lot of intergenerational trauma in that experience as well.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, I'm like, wait, we need to talk about this.
Yeah.
This is a thing, you know.
Yeah.
So I hopefully am one of many people in a movement to acknowledge and speak openly about a lot of these issues that are part of our communities.
Yeah. I want to say thank you for being vulnerable enough to share that and share your unpacking and share your story, because I think that's one of the missing pieces I would say for men in particular, but for anyone, to just be willing to share their true authentic story and to share their trauma, how they processed it, the sadness, the grief, the elation, the moments of clarity. I think if we all did that more, we would recognize how much we are alike and how our differences are very little.
Right.
And very much surface. So thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
We could just end it there, but I don't want to. Or should
What else? Whatever you got.
Yeah.
I'm game. This is cool. It's cool for me because, like, I haven't really had to explain. When people ask me, like, so what was this show? It's still, even before, it was hard to explain, like, what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And after, it's hard to explain, like, even after what it was.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my friend Rocky put it this way. It's like a performative TED Talk / cabaret. Yeah. So I'm like, I guess, like, two of my huge main inspirations for it were John Leguizamo. He has a special on Netflix called Latin History for Morons, which ran on Broadway. Highly recommend.
Cool. I didn't know that it ran on Broadway.
Oh yeah, it ran for a few months, right across the street from Miss Saigon. So I saw it every night, and I would see all the artwork to advertise it for the show. And then Hassan Minhaj, he has his series Patriot Act on Netflix. Those are, like, two very, very good inspirations that I kind of drew from and am inspired by, because they're both amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk about anything else? Like,
So what's next? What do you envision for the future?
that's a really good question, because I do feel a little in flux right now. But so I've had this whole entire week off from the show. We're on layoff, which means that there's no show running this week, which also means I don't get paid. But I still treat it like a vacation, because it's like, who else gets, like, a week off work?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this week has been really interesting because it turned into this. I wasn't expecting it. I thought it was just going to be like a week of literally relaxing, like, right here and meditating and not doing anything the entire week.
Yeah.
Instead, it's been very reaffirming of the journey that I was on the last time I was here when I did my show, in terms of the message that I want to do. And that, for example, my sister Robin, who lives in Manteca but works in Stockton, earlier this week she was like, you want to come hang out in Manteca? And I was like, yeah, sure. In my mind, I was like, it's kind of far, and I
Yeah.
don't really feel like driving that far. I don't know what we're gonna do up
Yeah.
there, but so Thursday, I reached out. Thursday morning. I was like, "What time you get off work?" She's like 5:30. So I was like, "Okay." She's like, "Oh yeah. Also, there's this Dolores Huerta exhibition being shown. Dolores Huerta, who worked alongside Cesar Chavez, and started the United Farm Workers movement. And so I looked into it, and it was like a presentation about Dolores Huerta, and she was going to be there. So I was like, oh my god. So we went, and there's this exhibition on her, like this traveling Smithsonian exhibition about her and her life's work as an activist, and she's there, and I snapped a photo with her, and I got to thank her for her work, and like you alongside Larry Itliong, who is like the Cesar Chavez of our movement, essentially started the farm workers movement, which started the larger farm workers UFW movement that Cesar Chavez was ahead
Stockton,
of.
Right?
In Stockton, Delano, throughout the Central Valley, California. Anyway, so I got to thank her in person, like in Stockton, and I got to hang out with my sister and just like chop it up, hang out. And then Friday night, I went to a Filipino punk rock show in San Francisco, where like somebody had said like, oh yeah, they kind of talk about like some political stuff, and I was like, you know what, I'll go and check it out, because I haven't really listened to punk music since I was in high school, and even then it wasn't real punk, it was like Yellow Card and Blink-182. And so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna go to this, and so I went, and there's this band, this Filipino punk band, and they start playing, and they're all super Filipino. They have like pretty thick accents, but they're based in New York. But there's this hardcore punk band. It's literally just like the But then between songs, the lead singer would be like, "You guys, you know, I just have a lot on my mind. I got to talk about this. Things are really fucked up in the Philippines right now, and we have this president Duterte who's killing people, and it's unjust." And I appreciate all of you for being here, because, you know, you're here and it's like you're supporting this cause with us. You're part of this movement to speak out against. It starts like letting out all of this shit. And then he'd be like, all right, this next song is called Fuck Duterte.
Yes.
It was so good though. And it like reminded me, I was like, yeah, like I remember back in high school, like I used to be into bands like System of a Down and Thrice and all these bands that rock used to get me into this, like it used to be that expression of aggression. And it also coincided at that point with the Iraq War. And this is something I thought about this past week. The reason why I went through that phase in high school, hip hop is something that I embraced much later in my life. Hip hop was as intensely. Hip hop was something I listened to, but at that period, it was primarily like it was the bling bling era. So it was this era of like, you know, money and promoting wealth and status, and it's kind of like the era of NWA kind of took a dip because the industry saw profitability in mainstream rap that only talked about money, cars, success.
Get bitches, make money.
It was kind of that period, and so it didn't quite express my political social concerns at the time in the way that rock did. And attending this rock show, this all Filipino punk rock show at Bindlestip Studios in San Francisco, part of Aklasan Fest, which happened this past weekend, it kind of reignited in my mind and made me realize, like, oh shit, yeah, it got me into that space again of like feeling just that rage of dissent and that rage of being against the system. Like I felt that at the show because he was speaking so passionately about like our countrymen in the Philippines. And then Saturday I went to another event at Manila Town Heritage Foundation in San Francisco at the International Hotel. It was a mixtape release party for this local rapper, named Mavi E. And he like talks about, he grew up in South Market area, like Soma Pilipinas, like, which had a large Filipino community. He grew up in that community, and he's rapping about issues like gentrification and displacement, and also getting hyphy and
Mhm.
going dumb and like
Mhm.
it was really fun.
Yeah.
And I was like, cool. So that was that.
Yeah.
And then Sunday was the 42nd anniversary of the eviction of the tenants of the International Hotel in San
Mhm.
Francisco,
Mhm.
which was a huge housing rights movement that my uncle Emil DeGuzman was a part of. He was at the forefront of it. It was that commemoration, so a lot of the activists were there speaking about that day. So unintentionally, this entire week just turned into reigniting that that passion, that
Yeah.
fire to tell stories.
Yeah.
So
And including this, you're telling your story.
yeah, I like want to continue to some way somehow,
Yeah.
but I also know that I'm still performing and I'm still capable of performing. But it's just the last 8 years of my career I've told other people's stories, and now I want to be a part of I want to be part of the process of lifting up other stories from other communities that we haven't necessarily heard from before. Whether it's going into the producing realm, as I kind of did, I dabbed into a little bit. Being a part of that process, some way, somehow, that's like my goal.
Yeah.
But as of right now, I'm doing Hello, Dolly, or as Regina King called, Black Panther for white people over 50. And it's kind of like, it's like a day job. That's how I look at it.
Yeah.
But I know that it still touches and affects a lot of people who see the show. So that's what I'm doing for now. And I'm just kind of like, figuring it out. You know how life works. You just kind of figure it out.
Ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
Any pieces of advice as you have an audience of these geese that come by?
Oh, hey, geese. Oh, they're so regal.
I know.
Pieces of advice. I'd say that there's peace in everything, even in tumultuous emotional periods. There is always something to find peace to settle into. And when you know that and remind yourself that, then there's comfort there.
Comfort in the discomfort. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to share this space.
Thank you for trusting me with this space.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm gonna put your contact info. It's like, are you on any of the social medias?
Yeah, I haven't been, if I'm being completely honest, Instagram, like I have a weird relationship with now.
Sure.
Because it kind of, in my eyes, it brings out the worst in my industry. The most disingenuous aspects of ourselves tend to come out.
Sure.
So I'm not as active on it, but if you choose to follow me, I have a lot of stuff that I've talked about in past posts at Julian DeGuzman. Same Twitter handle, more active on Twitter. I tweet a lot.
Cool.
It's not very healthy. Yeah. It isn't. It isn't. But
And so you're still in Hello Dolly, so if you're somewhere in the country that Hello Dolly's coming to, come check out Julian.
yeah, we'll be in Pittsburgh starting tomorrow, August 6th for a week, and then Boston, and then Kansas City, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Tucson, and then I have no idea.
That's okay. That's
Yeah.
a lot. That's a good math.
Yeah, I'm surprised I remember that many cities.
Yeah. Dope. So yeah, we'll put down there. I'll probably include some of the stuff from Conflicted. You have that website and stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Cool.
dopeness. That's it.
Salamat.
Maraming salamat. Peace. Much love.